Sophie Cunningham says, the article says, you say she's a MAGA Barbie. As some corners of the internet have taken to calling her, projection, she says, because of what she looks like and where she's from. She'll weigh in on how to, quote, protect women's sports, she says, because she's in that world and feels qualified to speak to that world. Quote, I got a lot of negative feedback about me hating trans, and I'm like, I never once said that, she says. I think that I'm here to extend love, but I also think with that love is truth, being honest. And I want to protect young girls in the locker room or young girls in sport who shouldn't have to go against biological men. Now, prior to yesterday's game, the Indiana Fever media, they flooded Sophie Cunningham. Apologize, Sophie, apologize! How dare you! And then Sophie Cunningham says,
in that story with ESPN, you talked about wanting to protect young girls who shouldn't have to go against biological men. Just can you expand your viewpoint on that?
I mean, I think I said what I said. I think it's kind of common sense. And I think I'll always believe in that. I think it's really important to protect children category. And so I stand on what I said, and I always believe that.
Yeah. Do you see your advocacy on that, like, taking any form going forward?
You know, I don't know. I'm not a very political person, but I do have beliefs. I have morals, and I'll always stand on those and be true to who I am. And I think people are going to take it how they want to take it, but I've never even really said anything about that. And so when it comes just to protecting young girls in sport and women in sport, I feel very strongly about that. I think that's why you have Title IX. That's why you have some of the greats in women's sports. If Title IX and women's sports weren't protected, then you wouldn't hear about any type of women in sport. And so I think in the future, it's just really important to protect.
Do you think, I guess along the line like that, it goes against perhaps, some people might say, hey, for the trans community, this could be something that could come back on us or be targeted against us. Like, how do you, I guess, view that sort of critique?
You know, like I said, I extend love, and I don't dislike anyone. Like, I think.
Right now, the Indiana Fever organization is imploding in real time, and nobody saw this coming. What started as a single player speaking her mind has snowballed into something far bigger, something that's now got the league scrambling, the front office in complete panic mode, and one of the most talented rosters in basketball history turning against its own leadership. The cracks were always there, but this week, they completely shattered. We're talking behind-the-scenes retaliation, a rookie phenom taking a stand against her coach, and a situation so explosive that it's forcing people in positions of power to choose sides. The story you're about to hear reveals exactly how one honest statement became the catalyst for organizational chaos. This isn't about basketball anymore. It's about what happens when players refuse to stay silent and what those in charge will do to keep them quiet. Buckle up, because the fallout from this is far from over. To understand how the Indiana Fever imploded, you need to know who Sophie Cunningham is and why what she said mattered so much. She's not some rookie trying to make headlines or a veteran chasing attention on social media. Cunningham has spent her entire career as a reliable, hardworking guard who shows up, does her job, and doesn't seek the spotlight. She's the kind of player coaches love because she doesn't create drama. She just plays. But over the past year, something shifted. Cunningham started paying attention to conversations happening in women's sports, specifically around fairness, safety, and protection for female athletes. And unlike most players who stay quiet on controversial topics, she decided to speak up. In an interview, Cunningham discussed her views on protecting young girls in competitive sports environments. She emphasized that she wasn't speaking from a place of hate or political motivation. Her concern was straightforward. Girls in locker rooms and on athletic fields deserve protections that ensure fair competition and safety. She explained that this belief wasn't about disliking anyone or targeting any community. It was about acknowledging biological differences in athletic competition and making sure that young female athletes had spaces where those differences were considered. She mentioned Title IX, the landmark legislation that protects women's sports opportunities, and stressed how crucial that protection remains. Her tone throughout was measured and careful. She wasn't ranting or inflammatory. She was simply stating what she believed to be true. What made Cunningham different from other athletes avoiding this topic entirely was her willingness to connect her belief to action. She said she felt a responsibility to speak, because she's part of the sports world and understands these issues from the inside. She wasn't speaking as a political activist or someone trying to build a brand. She was speaking as a woman who plays professional basketball and cares about the future of female athletics. When pressed on whether her comments might negatively affect the transgender community, Cunningham doubled down, but also softened her position slightly. She clarified that she extends love to everyone and that there's room for all people in society. She wasn't saying she hated anyone. She was saying that loving everyone and protecting women's sports could coexist. You could have compassion for people and still believe in biological categories in sports. Those two things weren't mutually exclusive in her mind. The media coverage that followed was immediate. Within hours, major outlets were running stories about her comments. Some outlets framed her as courageous for speaking truth. Others positioned her as controversial, maybe even divisive. The narrative split along predictable lines, but what Cunningham didn't expect was how aggressively her own organization would respond to her words. She wasn't asking for a platform. She wasn't calling a press conference. She was answering questions in an interview, being honest about her beliefs. That honesty, though, set off alarms in the Indiana front office. The Fever's management suddenly faced a choice. They could publicly support their player and her right to have personal beliefs, or they could attempt to distance themselves from her comments and hope the controversy blew over. Some organizations might have taken the first approach, understanding that their role is to protect their players and allow them to be human beings with perspectives. But Indiana Fever management seemed to panic. Instead of standing by Cunningham, they started asking questions internally about whether she represented the organization's values. They began wondering if she was creating a distraction. They started calculating the PR damage. What happened next revealed a disconnect between what the organization claimed to believe and how it actually treated its players. Before a game, media members were encouraged, or so it seemed, to press Cunningham on her statements and ask if she'd reconsider her position. The subtext was clear. The organization wanted her to apologize, to walk back what she'd said, to prove that she understood the boundaries of acceptable speech for a professional athlete. When reporters asked her about expanding on her viewpoint, expecting her to soften or retreat, Cunningham instead doubled down. "I think I said what I said," she told them. "I think it's kind of common sense." She wasn't angry or defensive in her tone. She was calm and certain. That composure probably infuriated the people in power, even more than if she'd lashed out. What made Cunningham's position so powerful was that she wasn't claiming to be an expert on everything. She wasn't making this her entire identity. She was simply saying that as a woman in sports, she had genuine concerns about fairness and safety, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise just because it made other people uncomfortable. She acknowledged that people would take her words however they wanted to take them. She accepted that criticism would come, but she made it clear that she wouldn't apologize for having beliefs or for being honest about them. That refusal to bend, to apologize for existing and thinking, became the moment that everything changed. Because someone in the organization decided that Cunningham needed to be taught a lesson about staying in line. What happened next unfolded behind closed doors, but the effects were visible to anyone paying attention. Sophie Cunningham's playing time mysteriously dropped. In games immediately following her media statements, she went from her usual rotation minutes to something dramatically reduced. One game she played only 7 minutes in the first half, something insiders confirmed hadn't happened all season under normal circumstances. The message being sent was unmistakable. Step out of line with your personal beliefs, and your professional opportunities disappear. This wasn't a coincidence. This was calculated. Stephanie White, the head coach, had made her displeasure known in private conversations that leaked to people close to the team. She was angry, genuinely angry, that Cunningham had spoken publicly about controversial topics without checking with management first. In the world of professional sports, there's an unspoken rule. Your job is to play basketball, win games, and say the things we tell you to say in public. Anything outside that scope is seen as a threat. White seemed determined to enforce that rule through playing time reduction, which is one of the most effective tools a coach has to punish a player without it looking obvious. But the retaliation went deeper than just minutes. According to multiple insiders, Cunningham was removed from certain offensive plays and strategies. She was benched during crucial moments. In team meetings, there was tension. Staff members were reportedly instructed to handle her differently than other players. The overall message filtering through the locker room was clear. If you say things that upset management, you will pay a price. This was a warning not just for Cunningham, but for every other player watching. Speak up about anything controversial, and this is what happens to you. What White apparently didn't understand was that she was creating an environment of fear and control rather than leadership. A real leader builds trust with their players. A real leader protects their team members, even when those team members say things the leader might not personally agree with. A real leader says, "I support your right to have beliefs, even if I don't share them." Instead, White chose punishment. She chose to use her authority as a weapon. The organization's public response was carefully crafted corporate language. A statement came out saying that players were thoughtful adults with their own perspectives and voices, and those views were their own. The Fever claimed to be committed to welcoming fans from every background and treating everyone with respect. It was the kind of statement designed to satisfy everyone and commit to nothing. But internally, the message was different. Internally, the message was that Cunningham had crossed a line, and she needed to understand that there were consequences. The psychological toll of this kind of retaliation is significant. Cunningham went to work every day knowing that her coach was upset with her, that her playing time was being used as punishment, that she'd become a problem in the organization's eyes simply for answering questions honestly. She couldn't talk about what was happening because speaking about it would only make things worse. She couldn't defend herself publicly because that would create more drama. She was trapped in a situation where staying silent meant accepting the punishment, and speaking up meant confirming that she was a troublemaker. Other players noticed what was happening. They watched Cunningham's minutes disappear. They saw her benched in important moments. They understood exactly what message was being sent. Some probably thought, "I need to be more careful about what I say. I need to watch what I do in interviews. I need to stay in line so this doesn't happen to me." That's the entire point of retaliation like this. It's not really about punishing one person. It's about controlling everyone through fear. What White miscalculated was the strength of the bonds between players on the roster. She assumed that if she punished one player, the others would fall in line and protect their own playing time. She assumed that professional athletes would prioritize their minutes and their paychecks over standing up for a teammate. She assumed that loyalty to the team and coach would outweigh loyalty to each other. That assumption turned out to be catastrophically wrong. Additionally, White underestimated the power of public scrutiny. She probably thought that if she quietly reduced Cunningham's minutes and the media didn't explicitly call it out, nobody would know it was retaliation. She didn't account for basketball analysts actually tracking playing time statistics. She didn't account for people in the organization leaking information to insiders who would report on it. She thought she could execute this punishment quietly and maintain the appearance of normal team operations. But in the age of social media and instant information sharing, nothing stays hidden. Everything gets noticed, analyzed, discussed, and dissected. And that's when things escalated in a way White absolutely didn't see coming. If Stephanie White thought she could quietly punish Sophie Cunningham without consequences, she wasn't prepared for what came next. Caitlyn Clark, the franchise's franchise player, the rookie sensation who's already transformed women's basketball, was watching everything unfold. And she was furious. Clark had come into the WNBA as a generational talent, the kind of player who arrives once in a decade. She was expected to be the future of the franchise, the player who would carry Indiana back to championship contention. But her first season in the league hadn't been easy. She dealt with rough fouls that seemed to target her. She'd absorbed criticism from veteran players who seemed jealous of her abilities and the attention she was receiving. She'd navigated a coaching staff that didn't always maximize her talents on offense. She'd been managing a lot, and she'd been doing it professionally, trying not to complain, trying to be the kind of rookie who shows up and proves herself. But watching her coach systematically punish a teammate for speaking her mind became the final straw. For Clark, it wasn't just about basketball anymore. It was about principle. It was about what kind of organization she wanted to play for. It was about whether the people leading her team actually believed in standing up for players or whether they were just concerned with controlling the narrative and protecting themselves. The tension that had been building all season came to a head. According to reports from people close to the team, Clark confronted White directly. The conversation was heated. Clark questioned why her teammate was being treated this way. She asked why the organization claimed to support its players while simultaneously punishing one for having personal beliefs. She made it clear that she didn't agree with what was happening, and she wasn't going to stay silent about it. What happened next was extraordinary. During a team event, Clark made public remarks that amounted to a direct challenge to the organization's authority. She talked about the league being about inclusiveness and elevating women. She talked about protecting players and supporting them. She talked about the responsibility everyone in the organization had to each other. On the surface, her comments seemed general and focused on league values, but everyone understood what she was really saying. She was defending Cunningham. She was calling out the hypocrisy of an organization that claimed to value its players while treating one player as a problem to be managed. More dramatically, there were reports of a locker room confrontation that was far more direct than anything said publicly. According to insiders, Clark went off on White in a way that completely undermined the coach's authority. She allegedly called out the retaliation, the unfair treatment, the message being sent to the rest of the locker room. She pushed back against the notion that players should apologize for having beliefs. She made it clear that she wouldn't accept this kind of leadership anymore. What made this moment so significant was what it represented. Caitlyn Clark is the financial engine of the entire franchise. She's the reason fans are buying tickets and jerseys. She's the reason national media is covering the Fever. She's the most valuable asset the organization has. If you're a coach or a front office executive, losing the support and trust of your franchise player is a catastrophic failure. And Clark made it clear that's exactly what was happening. The other players watched this unfold. They saw their rookie superstar stand up to the coach. They saw her defend a teammate. They saw her refuse to accept the status quo. That's powerful. That's the kind of leadership that bonds a team together. That's the kind of moment that either tears an organization apart or forces it to change course immediately. What White didn't understand was that she'd created an enemy in the one person she absolutely couldn't afford to have as an enemy. She'd chosen to punish a veteran player while hoping to maintain control over her superstar. But Clark saw through that immediately. She understood that if management could do this to Cunningham, they could do it to anyone. She understood that standing by silently meant accepting an organization built on fear and control rather than trust and support. The aftermath was complete organizational dysfunction. White had lost the locker room. The players were unified against her. The coaching staff's authority had evaporated. The front office was in panic mode, trying to figure out how to fix a situation that had spiraled completely out of their control. And Cunningham, the player who was supposed to be the problem, had become the symbol of integrity in an organization that was revealing its true values through its actions. What happened next would force everyone involved to make choices about what they actually believed in and what they were willing to fight for. Just when the Indiana Fever thought the situation couldn't get worse, external forces entered the equation in a way nobody anticipated. The controversy surrounding Cunningham's statements had gained significant traction in the national conversation. People across the country were discussing her position, debating whether she was right, and paying attention to how the organization responded. That level of public attention meant that this was no longer just a team issue or even just a league issue. It was becoming a cultural moment. Then came the moment that completely shifted the power dynamics. The presidential administration publicly weighed in on the controversy. A representative made statements indicating support for Cunningham's position and her right to express her beliefs. This wasn't a random celebrity or a talking head on cable news. This was the highest levels of the federal government signaling that they stood with Cunningham and against the organizational retaliation she was facing. The impact of this cannot be overstated. Suddenly, the narrative flipped completely. Instead of Cunningham being a problem player who needed to be brought in line, she was now a player who was being unfairly targeted by her organization. Instead of the Fever being justified in their retaliation, they were now on the wrong side of a major cultural and political moment. The organization had tried to suppress and punish a player for her beliefs, and the federal government had called them out for it. White's position became instantly untenable. She'd been counting on the organization to back her play and quietly support her retaliation behind closed doors. She'd been betting that nobody outside the team would fully understand what was happening. She'd miscalculated on almost every level. Now, instead of managing a small controversy within the team, she was facing national scrutiny and condemnation. The attempt to silence Cunningham had backfired spectacularly. For Cunningham herself, the presidential backing was validating. She'd stood by her beliefs, refused to apologize, and now the highest office in the country was publicly supporting her position. She wasn't a controversial troublemaker stirring up drama. She was a woman standing up for her convictions while her organization tried to punish her for it. That narrative is powerful, and it was now the dominant narrative in the national conversation. The Fever's communications team went into overdrive trying to do damage control. They released statements about supporting diverse perspectives and treating everyone with respect. But those statements rang hollow given what had just happened with Cunningham. The organization's actions had revealed that their public statements about values didn't match their private behavior. They talked about inclusivity and respect while simultaneously retaliating against a player for her personal beliefs. That hypocrisy was now exposed on a national stage. What made this development particularly significant was that it completely removed the Fever's ability to contain the situation. They couldn't just wait for the news cycle to move on. They couldn't hope that people would forget about it. This was now a cultural conversation that was being discussed at the highest levels of government. It was being debated on national news networks. It was being analyzed by political commentators. The organization had lost control of the narrative entirely. For White, this represented the point of no return. She'd gambled that her authority as coach would be respected, that the organization would back her play, and that Cunningham would either apologize or accept her diminished role quietly. None of those things had happened. Instead, she'd created a situation where her own coach was now politically isolated, her organization was under national scrutiny, and her star player was openly opposing her leadership. Clark watched this unfold and understood that she'd been right to take a stand. She'd defended her teammate when it would have been easier to stay silent. She'd challenged her coach when she could have just accepted the situation. And now, the entire country was agreeing with her position. That vindication probably gave her even more confidence that she'd made the right choice. The presidential intervention also sent a message to other players in the league. If you stand up for your beliefs and your organization retaliates, the public will support you. That's a powerful message. It means that players don't have to accept unfair treatment silently. It means that speaking truth has consequences, but sometimes those consequences ultimately protect you rather than hurt you. For the league itself, this was becoming a serious problem. The Wnba had marketed itself as progressive and inclusive. Now, one of its organizations was being called out for retaliation against a player, and the federal government was taking notice. Commissioner's office had to be in absolute panic mode, trying to figure out how to manage the situation before it damaged the league's reputation further. White had set out to enforce discipline and control. She'd ended up creating a situation that undermined her authority completely, united the team against her, brought national and federal attention to organizational misconduct, and turned a single player's statement into a cultural moment. It was possibly the worst possible outcome of her attempt at retaliation, and it set the stage for what came next. With the presidential backing and public support now firmly behind Cunningham, the situation inside the Fever organization reached a critical breaking point. The coaching staff's authority was hanging by a thread. The players were united against management. And Caitlyn Clark, the franchise's most valuable asset, was actively leading what amounted to a rebellion against the people running the team. What happened next was described by people close to the organization as absolutely explosive. During a team meeting or locker room session, Clark went off in a way that completely shattered any remaining veneer of organizational unity. This wasn't a carefully worded statement for the media. This wasn't a diplomatic conversation with leadership. This was raw, unfiltered frustration from a player who'd reached her absolute limit with the situation. According to reports, Clark called out the entire system that had been failing her and her teammates. She talked about the mistreatment she'd endured all season, the physical fouls that seemed targeted, the media criticism that felt personal, the offensive limitations imposed on her by a coaching staff that didn't seem to fully understand how to utilize her talents. She talked about watching her teammates get punished for speaking their minds. She talked about an organization that claimed to have values but didn't actually live by them. More specifically, she directly addressed the retaliation against Cunningham. She made it clear that what the organization had done was wrong. She explained that punishing a teammate for having personal beliefs violated everything the organization claimed to stand for. She challenged White's leadership and her right to control players through fear and reduced playing time. She made it known that she wouldn't accept this kind of environment anymore. What made this moment so powerful was the tone Clark used. She wasn't being diplomatic or careful with her words. She was frustrated, disappointed, and angry. She was expressing genuine emotion about a situation that had become unbearable. The other players in that locker room heard her voice shaking, probably saw her emotion, and understood that this was a moment where their star player was finally breaking with the people running the organization. The physical description of the moment painted a picture of complete organizational breakdown. Clark allegedly slammed her locker or made other physical gestures that conveyed her frustration. Her voice was loud enough to reverberate through the locker room space. The people in that room understood that they were witnessing something significant, a moment where a franchise player was openly rebelling against her coach and the front office. From that point forward, the dynamic had completely shifted. The locker room was no longer united behind coaching and management. It was united behind Clark and Cunningham against the leadership structure. Any attempt by White to exercise authority after that moment would be met with resistance. Any instruction she gave would be questioned. Any decision she made would be suspect. She'd lost the locker room completely. What White probably realized at this point was that she'd made a catastrophic mistake. She'd thought she could punish one player as a warning to everyone else. Instead, she'd created a martyr. She'd united the team against her. She'd forced her franchise player to take a public stand against her. She turned a simple situation where a player said something controversial into an organizational crisis where her entire leadership structure was under question. The front office was now in the position of having to choose. They could back their coach and accept the consequences of losing their franchise players' trust and probably the unity of the locker room. Or they could accept that White had failed and begin the process of moving in a different direction. There was no middle ground anymore. There was no way to patch this over with a few statements and some time. The damage had been done. For Cunningham, this moment represented total vindication. She'd stood by her beliefs, refused to apologize, and now not only was the national conversation supporting her, but her own teammates were openly defending her and rejecting the retaliation. She'd been right to stand firm. She'd been right to refuse to bend. And now that refusal was being validated by the people closest to her. The other players in the locker room also received a powerful message. They saw that standing up for what's right, even when it challenges authority, can create change. They saw that unified action from multiple players carries more weight than individual complaints. They saw that their superstar was willing to risk her relationship with the coaching staff to defend a teammate's right to have beliefs. That's the kind of leadership that bonds a team together in ways that coaching staff actions never can. The psychological effect on the organization was profound. The culture had shifted from one based on control and fear to one based on solidarity and mutual support. Players were now looking to each other for leadership instead of to the coaching staff. Trust in management had evaporated. The entire organizational structure was operating on fumes. What nobody knew at this point was what would come next, whether the front office would make changes, whether White would be removed, whether the team could move forward from this breaking point. But everyone understood that things could never go back to the way they were before. The Fever organization had fundamentally changed, and the change had been forced by players who were unwilling to accept mistreatment and retaliation anymore. just when it seemed like the Cunningham situation had consumed all the organizational chaos the Fever could handle, another major story broke that made things exponentially worse. Breena Turner, a player with the organization, came forward with allegations of harassment involving a member of the coaching or staff structure. The specific details weren't immediately public, but the implication was clear. There was a serious personnel issue that the organization had apparently been managing quietly behind the scenes. The timing of Turner's disclosure was either perfectly coincidental or strategically connected to the larger chaos unfolding within the organization. Either way, it added another layer of dysfunction to an already fractured team. Suddenly, the Fever weren't just dealing with coaching decisions being questioned and player solidarity against management. They were now dealing with allegations of misconduct that suggested systemic problems went beyond what anyone had previously understood. What made this particularly damaging was the appearance that the organization had known about these issues and hadn't properly addressed them. If Turner had been dealing with harassment and the organization had mishandled the situation, it suggested that the culture problems ran even deeper than the Cunningham retaliation situation had revealed. It suggested that this wasn't an isolated incident of a coach overstepping her authority. It suggested that the entire organizational structure had serious issues with how it treated its players. The Fever quickly released a statement about the matter. They said they took concerns seriously, investigated thoroughly, and acted promptly when appropriate. They talked about protecting people in the organization and ensuring everyone was treated with professionalism and respect. But like the earlier statements from the organization, these words rang hollow given the context of everything that had just happened. From the public perspective, the organization's careful language in their statement, refusing to name names or provide specific details about what had happened, looked like they were covering something up. If a player had been harassed and the organization had fired or removed someone, why not just say that directly? Why all the vague corporate language? The refusal to provide specifics actually created more suspicion rather than less. What the organization probably didn't realize was that in trying to protect the privacy of everyone involved and avoid legal liability, they were actually creating the perception of a cover-up. People online immediately started speculating about who the accused person might be. They were guessing about the specific nature of the harassment. They were questioning whether the organization had actually done enough. The mystery created by the lack of transparency actually made the situation worse, not better. For Turner, coming forward during this period of organizational chaos meant that her allegations were getting attention they might not have otherwise received. The spotlight was already on the Fever. The organization was already under scrutiny. The locker room was already united in skepticism toward management. So when Turner's story broke, it added to the narrative that this was an organization with serious systemic problems. The situation also raised questions about how many other issues might be lurking beneath the surface. If there was harassment that had been handled quietly, what else had the organization been managing behind closed doors? What other problems had players been dealing with that the public didn't know about? Were there other players with complaints who hadn't come forward yet? The discovery of one serious issue created suspicion that there might be many more. For the front office, this was the moment where they probably realized they had lost complete control of the narrative and the situation. They were now dealing with multiple major issues simultaneously. The Cunningham situation was still unresolved. White's authority was completely undermined. The locker room was fractured. And now there were allegations of harassment that suggested the organizational culture was even more broken than anyone had realized. What should have been a straightforward personnel matter, addressing alleged harassment appropriately, had become another example of organizational dysfunction. The response had been too vague, too corporate, too protective of people in power, and not sufficiently protective of the player coming forward. That's exactly the kind of response that creates further mistrust and suggests that the organization prioritizes protecting itself over protecting its players. The cascade of problems was becoming impossible to manage. Each new revelation or development made the situation worse. Each statement from the organization seemed to make things more suspicious rather than more transparent. Each day that passed without major changes to the coaching staff or front office seemed to confirm what players already believed. That management didn't actually care about the issues being raised, they just wanted everything to go away quietly. For Cunningham and Clark, the Turner situation was probably validating in a different way. It suggested that their concerns about the organization's culture were justified. It showed that they weren't being overly dramatic or making mountains out of molehills. There were actual serious problems with how the organization treated its players. Standing up and demanding change suddenly looked even more important. The Turner situation also made it clear that the organization's problems weren't about one personality conflict or one player saying something controversial. The problems were systemic. They involved how the organization treated its players, how it handled sensitive situations, how it prioritized protecting people in power versus protecting vulnerable players coming forward with allegations. That's the kind of organizational culture that doesn't fix itself with a few statements and some time. That requires fundamental change in leadership and approach. As the dust began to settle on the immediate chaos, the Indiana Fever found themselves in a position they'd never faced before. The organization was in complete standoff mode. On one side, you had management and coaching staff trying to maintain authority and control. On the other side, you had a unified locker room led by Caitlyn Clark and backed by public opinion, national media scrutiny, and federal-level attention. The outcome would determine not just the immediate future of the franchise, but potentially set a precedent for how the entire league handled similar situations. The critical question facing the organization was simple but consequential. Would they remove Stephanie White and make significant changes to the coaching staff and front office approach, or would they try to maintain the status quo and hope that time would heal the wounds? From a practical standpoint, maintaining the status quo was almost impossible at this point. White had lost the locker room. She had no authority left with the players. Any instruction she gave would be questioned or ignored. Any decision she made would be subject to scrutiny. She couldn't effectively coach a team that didn't respect her leadership anymore. But removing her also created significant complications. It meant admitting that she'd made serious errors in judgment. It meant accepting that she'd mishandled a situation in a way that damaged the organization. It meant confirming what everyone already suspected, that she'd been wrong to retaliate against Cunningham and wrong to underestimate the response from Clark and the rest of the team. For an organization and leadership structure that had been trying to maintain control through careful messaging and selective transparency, this admission of failure was difficult. The financial implications were also significant. White had a contract. Removing her would involve financial consequences, but keeping her would cost far more in terms of team dysfunction, potential player departures, and the organization's public reputation. There were no good options, only less bad ones. For the players, the standoff represented a moment of testing. How committed were they to their position? Would they remain unified if the organization dug in and refused to make changes? Would they continue to refuse to accept White's authority? Would they potentially demand trades or use other leverage to force organizational change? The power dynamic had shifted significantly in favor of the players, but only if they maintained unity and didn't accept compromises that didn't address the fundamental issues. Cunningham herself was in a unique position. She'd become the symbol of standing up for principles despite retaliation. She'd become the player who refused to apologize for having beliefs. She'd shown that players didn't have to accept punishment for speaking their minds. But she was also caught in an organization undergoing crisis. Would she want to continue playing for the Fever under these circumstances? Would she potentially request a trade? Or would she stay and see if the organization made genuine changes? Clark's position was equally complex. She'd staked her reputation on defending Cunningham and demanding change. She'd openly challenged White's authority. She'd unified the locker room against management. But she was also the franchise's future and the organization's most valuable asset. She probably didn't want to leave if the organization made genuine changes and brought in new leadership. But she also couldn't back down now without losing credibility with her teammates. The national conversation continued to circle around several key questions. Would the WNBA take official action against the Fever organization for how it had handled the situation? Would there be consequences for White's retaliation? Would the league make changes to protect players' right to have personal beliefs without fear of professional retaliation? Would the federal government continue to pay attention to what was happening, or would they consider the matter addressed once the presidential comments had been made? Media analysts were divided on what should happen next. Some argued that White needed to be removed because she'd fundamentally broken the trust between coach and player. Others suggested that the situation could potentially be salvaged if White apologized and made significant changes to how she approached the team. Still others believed that the entire front office and organizational structure needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, because the problems clearly went beyond one coach's decisions. From a basketball perspective, the question of timing was crucial. The regular season was still ongoing. Playoff implications were at stake. The team needed to play games and try to win. But how could they do that effectively when the fundamental structure of the organization was fractured? How could players focus on basketball when the culture of the team was in crisis? How could coaches effectively lead when they had no credibility with their players? The Fever faced a decision point that would determine their immediate future and potentially their long-term direction. They could try to limp through the rest of the season with the current structure and address changes in the offseason. But that risked ongoing locker room dysfunction and potential player departures. Or they could make bold changes immediately, acknowledge what had happened, and attempt to rebuild trust with their players. That would be harder and more painful in the short term, but it might preserve the team's long-term health and competitiveness. For the league as a whole, the situation was becoming a test of whether players had genuine agency and voice in professional sports, or whether organizations could control narratives and suppress player perspectives through retaliation. The outcome in Indiana would send a message to every other organization and every other player about what was possible and what wasn't acceptable anymore. The standoff would ultimately be resolved by choices made in the coming days and weeks. Would the organization blink first, or would they try to maintain their position? Would the players hold firm in their unity, or would some accept compromises? The answer would determine not just the Fever's future, but potentially the future of player power and voice in women's professional sports. What started as one player speaking her mind about women's sports protection has evolved into something far larger, a fundamental clash between organizational power and player agency. Sophie Cunningham refused to apologize for her beliefs. Caitlyn Clark refused to accept retaliation against her teammate, and together they exposed a culture of control that relied on fear and suppression. The Fever's attempt to silence one voice triggered a rebellion from the entire locker room, national media scrutiny, and federal-level attention. Now the organization faces an impossible choice: acknowledge the dysfunction and make serious changes, or attempt to maintain authority over players who have already rejected it. The standoff continues, but the power dynamics have fundamentally shifted. Players across the league are watching to see if genuine consequences come for organizations that retaliate against their own. This situation is far from over, and the resolution will set a precedent for how women's professional sports handles player rights and organizational accountability moving forward.